I've been watching through the Friday the 13th films with my friends Max and Donovan for a ranking video that we're doing on the former's channel. I'll link that in the description if it's out. And that included the crossover movie Freddy vs. Jason. I'd seen it before as my first exposure to both the Friday and Elm Street series, so now this time around I figured I'd check out the Nightmare on Elm Street movies so that I'm fully caught up in both ends before this rewatch. I didn't expect to get that much out of them since I'd already seen the first one and just thought it was alright, but to my surprise I liked it a lot better the second time around. Then after checking the rest out and joking to my friends that since these are so much better than the Freddy films, I'd rather be talking about them instead, I figured, well, what's stopping me? So since Max has been the one introducing me to all these horror franchises, I figured I'd release this on his birthday, on the opposite end of the year to Halloween. Never let them know your next move, I guess. Anyway, in the interest of keeping this video short and digestible enough for me to release between bigger projects, I'm not going to be thoroughly covering each movie individually. This will be just my overall thoughts on the various aspects of the entire franchise. And I will be spoiling stuff, so just be warned in case you were planning to go into any of these blind. First thing I want to briefly touch on is the music. These movies generally have pretty good atmospheric scores that fit when they need to be silly or intense, and there's no better example of that than the main theme. Not only my favourite horror theme I've heard so far, but one of my favourite themes to any film that I've heard. It's slow, suspenseful, and sounds sufficiently eerie and creepy. And it's surprisingly versatile in the different tones that they're able to use it for. They're able to alter it to sound more grand or more lighthearted, like for the talk show scene in New Nightmare. While I'm on the topic of tone, I may as well bring up that these films are a good level of scary for me. I'm not a difficult person to scare or startle at all. I am not built for horror movies, and I highly doubt I'll ever be checking out some of the ones that are highly regarded as the scariest of all time. But I can respect the hell out of this franchise for rarely dipping into cheap, loud, obnoxious jump scares. They instead have some pretty sick body horror with the practical effects that have aged surprisingly well, and they know when to take their time to build an unsettling atmosphere. It really helps having neither the characters or the audience know where Freddy is lurking in the dream world or what sick, twisted kill he has planned for them, really making you fear for their lives. The fact that I care about these characters' lives at all is a testament to how likeable most of them are. I never expected to come out of these genuinely caring about the human protagonists, but these movies pulled it off. They do well at showing the bond between everyone in the main group for each movie, giving personal stakes when one dies and having the initial protagonist within the larger cast be unclear, so you're not sure who will make it to the end. The first movie has the fake-out protagonist in Tina, who ends up being the first to fall to Freddy before Nancy takes over in the role. And the third movie has a huge cast with 7 kids in the main support group, plus Nancy and all the other adults. I really like how naturally the cast flows from movie to movie as well. The first movie establishes Nancy and her run-in with Krueger, then the second movie kinda goes off and does its own thing, but I like Jesse enough. The possession angle is a very unique take from the rest of them in terms of how Freddy torments him. Getting him to unwillingly kill his own coach and friend and then having a close call with his sister is a great way to get you emotionally invested in the hell that he's being put through. The third film brings Nancy back, showing that the events of the first movie put her on the path to becoming a therapist. She gets to help the rest of the Elm Street kids who all manage to have distinct, memorable, and endearing personalities. They're all sympathetic in their own way, and they always have you guessing which one's going to fall victim to Freddy next. The one I definitely wasn't expecting in that regard though was Nancy. I somehow managed to avoid the spoiler that she ends up dying at the end and the last scene is at her funeral. It caught me very off guard and managed to be pretty emotionally effective. Just like the fourth film where all the survivors from part 3 end up getting picked off near the beginning, leaving the new character Alice as our protagonist for this and the fifth movie where both her and her unborn baby get tormented. Then the sixth movie manifests Freddy's daughter from the aether. Wow, how riveting, who cares. I can only go so long without talking about the main event himself though. Freddy Krueger is easily my favourite of the big 3 slashers. I like Jason and Michael enough, but Frederick is on a whole other level above them. Being able to talk is one thing, but I find him so consistently entertaining in different ways across the whole franchise. The first 2 movies have him be more subdued and serious, with only a few jokes thrown in here and there, but I think Dream Warriors is where the character is operating at his full potential. Now he's getting to crack a lot more one-liners without diminishing his scare factor at all. Robert Englund is getting to ham it up with his performance while being a genuine menace, and it's delightful. You can tell he loves playing the character. The welcome to prime time bitch line is iconic for a reason. That's cinema, baby. Admittedly, I do think he starts to slip a little bit in the fourth movie. He's still great, don't get me wrong, but he's moving even further into the silly territory, and not all of it works for me. Most of his jokes land, but some like the Dr. Seuss line and the pizza scene were, I don't know, a bit much. Then along comes Dreamchild, and I'd say this is where the character is at its weakest. It feels like they try too hard to make him funny without all the jokes landing. Some are great, I love the bad year Dan bit, but overall it felt like the character had lost his edge. Doesn't help that they had him actively showing fear against someone who he easily clawed through at the end, so what was even the point? Miraculously though, Freddy's Dead brings it all back around. Not by making him scary again, he isn't in the slightest, but by leaning so hard into the Looney Tune angle that it loops back around to being funny again. I still say this is his second weakest showing in the original 6-film saga, but let it not be said that I don't find him very entertaining at the least. And when you're watching Freddy's Dead, you kinda have to take all the wins you can get. Teetering back into the universal positives across these movies though, Freddy's powers lead to infinite possibilities with how he can mess with people in their dreams and take advantage of their worst fears. Other slashers can feel limited in how they're able to take their victims out, but Freddy's able to do basically whatever he wants, and it leads to some glorious sequences, even in the weaker movies. I don't know how much I can show for the sake of not getting age-gated, but take my word for it that these are some gruesome kills. The puppet one in Dream Warriors especially, good God. And almost everything is done with practical effects, which look great. They only steer away from practical effects when absolutely necessary. Otherwise, these movies deliver on some iconic and brutal imagery that's going to stick with me for a while. I also quite like how Freddy has personal stakes in every single one of these stories, so it makes sense for him to be around. In the first one, he's going after the children of the people that burned him alive. In the second, he's sticking around the same house he was defeated in to possess the next resident. In the third, he's resolving his unfinished business with the remaining Elm Street kids, which he fully finishes off in part 4 before his attention has to shift to Alice, who gets Kristen's powers transferred to her. Alice beating him there means that naturally he wants revenge in the 5th movie, and then in the 6th movie, they take a hard left turn and introduce his daughter, who had never been mentioned once in any of the prior movies. How lovely. Okay, I've jabbed at them enough. I'll say that while I like the first 4 movies quite a bit, 5 and 6 don't really do it for me. I like Alice in the 5th movie, like I said before. I think Dan's death and his parents trying to claim Alice's unborn baby gives that part of the story some good emotional weight. I just don't much care for any of the side characters, and the whole plot of having to convince the non-believers that Freddy exists felt kinda played out and didn't manage to hook me at all. Doesn't help that Freddy himself is at his least entertaining here. Then Freddy's Dead does pick back up a bit with Freddy getting to be way more unhinged, but I don't think any other part of this movie works that well for me. The characters are all either slabs of cardboard or actively annoying with their bickering. Maggie is the least interesting protagonist in the series by far, which is odd since she has the most personal connection to Freddy, being his estranged daughter. And the basic, boring, wimpy final fight between the two with their groan-worthy quips was such a weak way for the character to go out. Unfortunately, these films kinda wore out their welcome by the end. I don't outright dislike the 5th film, but Freddy's Dead was such a big misfire and a sign that it was time to move on from this franchise. Or maybe it was a sign for someone to move back into the series. Wes Craven, creator of the series and director of the first movie, wasn't very involved with the sequels. He did the one movie back in 1984 and then that was it. That is, until 10 years later, where he got back in the director's seat for New Nightmare, which was the shot in the arm this series desperately needed. This movie is great. Usually it can be a tough sell to get a meta-narrative to work given how that's been misused nowadays, but this movie excels with it, following the Elm Street cast playing themselves in the real world as opposed to their characters, and a new form of Dream Demon going after them now that he's no longer trapped in the Elm Street movies under the guise of Freddy Krueger. I got really invested in Heather's story here, losing her husband and nearly losing her son multiple times to this monster. Speaking of her son, I think Miko Hughes gives a surprisingly good child performance. Outside of a few screechy bits, he never got on my nerves at all. When Heather's eventually forced back into the role of Nancy for real rather than on a film set, that's some cool shit. I love how it follows on from the other movies blurring the lines between dreams and reality, with this one blurring the line between reality, the dream world, and the fictional world of the Elm Street movies. It's so good, and also probably has my favourite score in the series. I love how grand it sounds. Unfortunately, it's kept from being the highlight of the franchise to me by a kinda weak final battle relative to some of the others, and this quote-unquote Freddy isn't quite as intimidating or anywhere near as fun to watch as the real deal. Otherwise though, this movie bangs, I love it. And that's not quite where this ends. Robert Englund has one final theatrical Freddy performance left in him, crossing over with Friday the 13th to fight Jason Voorhees in the last hurrah for both horror icons. Unfortunately, it has a pretty bog-standard human cast that fits more in with the Friday series than Elm Street. None of them are all that likeable or memorable. Besides the guy played by Jason Ritter who does the Dipper voice whenever he's stressed out, that's kinda funny. None of them are hateable, it's not an awful cast or anything, just a serviceable one that I don't care all that much about, out and kinda wish that one of the titular slashers got to be the main character this time around instead. When it's actually focusing on Freddy and Jason though, it's some of the best stuff in either franchise. I love how naturally their conflict escalates, with Freddy manipulating Jason to do his bidding, Jason going too far and stealing his kills which pisses Freddy off, and then Freddy revealing that he manipulated Jason which pisses him off and they start going at it. And both get to hold their own in their awesome fight scenes, with Freddy fittingly winning more in the dream world while Jason holds the edge in the real world. It's not that deep or anything, it's just a fun as hell crossover versus movie that feels sufficiently bloody and brutal, which was missing from a lot of the Friday films that I've seen beforehand. It also felt like a return to form for Freddy. He feels like a horror villain again rather than a cartoon character. And that about brings this to a close. So why don't I go and briefly rank these movies and give my thoughts individually before I wrap things up. Freddy's Dead is the worst one. Freddy is at least kinda funny, and I can see why some people consider it an ironic masterpiece, but the vast majority of it did nothing for me. Next is Dream Child. Just kinda mid, even if I liked Alice's story well enough. The supporting cast and Freddy himself unfortunately are not able to elevate this much further. Then we have Freddy vs. Jason, now we're getting into the good stuff. I think it's very telling that my second favourite Friday film ranks all the way down here when compared to the rest of the Elm Streets. I've heard it described as an Elm Street story with a Friday cast, and yeah, that seems about right. The main story of Freddy using Jason to bring fear of him back to Springwood is pretty interesting, even if our main group of meatbags is anything but. And the fights are stellar, obviously. Closing out the bottom half is Dream Master, a fairly solid time that hooked me with the deaths of the Dream Warrior survivors and endeared me to the friendships between our new main cast. I really liked it, but the final fight left a bit to be desired. And this is where you could start to see the cartoon character Freddy was about to become, which didn't suit him nearly as well as Jason. In fourth place is Freddy's Revenge, which he did not get because none of the first movie's cast are in this. I think that while this is a bit weaker than the first movie, it's still pretty damn fun and feels the closest to the original's dreamlike tone out of all the sequels, while still doing its own distinct thing with its self-contained cast and unique kind of threat that Freddy poses this time around. It's a bit slower and doesn't have as many creative and memorable dream sequences as the others, but overall I quite like it. Then we have the one that started it all. What else can I really say about this horror classic? The central protagonist is great, Freddy's a menacing villain with a good deal of mystery around what he is and why he's doing what he's doing. The kills are highlights of their franchise. I love this movie. The runner-up is New Nightmare, only held back from number 1 by the kinda weak final battle like I said before. The rest of the movie is still a blast, not being too self-indulgent with the meta-narrative and instead using it to give us a fresh take on the series. And I can't stress enough, I really love that talk show segment with Robert Englund in the Freddy fit. I think it's cool that's the only time we see him in that outfit in the film, not counting archive footage. And then at the top is Dream Warriors. It has my favourite human cast, my favourite dream sequences and kills, my favourite story, Freddy is best, an emotionally effective ending, and what would have been the perfect way to kill Freddy off for good. It's not just my favourite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but also my favourite from the big 3 slasher franchises by far, which admittedly does not include the Halloween sequels yet, but I also can't imagine I'm missing out on all that much. Overall, I had a really good time with these movies. I think it's safe to say I'm a fan of this franchise now. With only 2 exceptions out of 8 and only 1 real critical misfire, these are really fun slasher flicks that manage to keep me on the edge of my seat, make me laugh, and get me surprisingly attached to a lot of the characters. With that said, I binged these and 2/3 of the Friday the 13th franchise in barely over a month, so I think I've had my fill of slasher movies for quite some time now. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed. It's been a lot of fun talking about this series. Can't help but feel like I forgot something though. Oh right, the reboot can go fuck itself.